discuss undue influence. Already we have discussed free consent. When consent is caused by coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation and mistake, the consent is said to be not free consent. So here one of the element of free consent is undue influence. So section 14 provides consent is said to be free if the parties enter into a contract with free will. That means with no pressure and when it is not caused by coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation and mistake. So if it is not caused by any of the above element, the consent is said to be free consent. As stated above, consent given by party must be absent of undue influence. So earlier already I have discussed coercion. So today let us discuss undue influence. In some instances, the parties to an agreement are so placed to each other that one party is in position to dominate the will of the other party. Consequently, the other party is compelled to enter into an agreement against his will and as a result of unfair influence. So here one of the party he compelled to enter into an agreement against his will and as a result of unfair influence, he is compelled to enter into an agreement. Such an agreement is said to be induced by undue influence. Sometimes a party is compelled to enter into contract against his will as a result of unfair persuasion by the other party. Section 16 defines undue influence as follows. A contract is said to be induced by undue influence where the relations subsisting or existing between the parties are such that one of the parties is in position to dominate the will of the other and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage over the other. For example, in case of a teacher and student or the banker and his client, these are the one of the person is in dominating position of the other party. A person is deemed to be in position to dominate the will of the other, a where he holds a real or apparent authority over the other. For example, master and the servant, police officer and the accused, or where he stands in a fiduciary relation to the other. Fiduciary relations means where the utmost good faith, where it is required, those relations are called fiduciary relation. For example, solicitor and client, doctor and patient, father and son, or we can say here trustee and beneficiaries. Or B, where he makes a contract with a person whose mental capacity is temporarily or permanently affected by reason of age, illness, or mental or bodily distress. For example, medical attendant and his patient, or old illiterate person. Number 3, where a person who is in position to dominate the will of the another enters into a contract with him and the transaction appears on the face of it or on the evidence adduced to be unconscionable. The burden of proving that such contract was not induced by undue influence shall lie upon the person who is in position to dominate the will of the other. Let us discuss the essentials of undue influence. In case of undue influence, there are two persons. Number 2, the relations are satisfying between them. Number 3, one must dominate the will of the other. Number 4, there must be unfair advantage. The unfair advantage must be taken by the person who is in dominating position. Number 5, it involves the moral pressure. So undue influence is also called as moral coercion. There is an undue influence between the following persons: principal and agent, superior and subordinate, doctor and patient, father and son, teacher and student, promoter and the company, master and servant, spiritual advisor and devotee. Example. So let us discuss example. A having advanced money to his son B during his minority obtains upon B's coming of age by misuse of parental influence a bond from B for a greater amount than the sum due in respect of the advance. A employs undue influence. Another illustration. A man enfeebled by disease or age is induced by B's statement to agree to pay to B an unreasonable sum or amount for his professional services. So here B employs undue influence. Among the following relations, there is presumption that there is no undue influence. Number one, wife and husband, landlord and tenant. Number three, debtor and creditor. So let us discuss case law. In case of Ranjana Purna versus Swaminathan, A. A poor Hindu widow was persuaded by a money lender to agree to pay 100% rate of interest on money lent by him. She needed the money to establish her right to maintenance. So it was clear case of undue influence and the court reduced the rate of interest to 24%. So 100% was inexorbitant rate of interest. Section 19, subclause A, deals with consequences of agreements obtained by undue influence. When consent to an agreement is obtained by undue influence, the agreement is a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was so obtained. So any such contract may be set aside either absolutely or if the party who is entitled to avoid it has received any benefit thereunder upon such terms and conditions as to the court may seem just and equitable. So this is section 19 subclause A. Let us discuss case law Alcard versus Skinner. In the instance case, the plaintiff lady, age 35 years of age, became a sister of the Protestant institution called the Sisters of the Poor. The defendant was the spiritual director and confessor of the sisterhood. The plaintiff took a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience and consequently surrendered to the institution all her individual property worth pounds 7,000. In 1879, she renounced her sisterhood, by which time all but pound 1671 has paid by the defendant for the purpose of the institution. The plaintiff kept silent till 1885 and then sued for recovery of pound 1671 on the plea that it was procured by undue influence of the defendant. The Court of Appeal found there was no personal pressure and the sole explanation of the gift was her own submission to the oath of poverty. Nevertheless, the court found that the spiritual pressure rendered her consent illusory. Once she renounced the sisterhood, the pressure was removed and no money could be further spent for the sisterhood without her consent, and so the money was recoverable. But despite all these findings, the court refused the plaintiff relief on the ground of laches. Laches means unreasonable delay in making assertion of right or claim. So here the court refused the plaintiff relief on the ground of laches and her apparent acquiescence, that is approval for 6 years even after she left the sisterhood. Though no statute of limitation barred the relief in equity, the court was unwilling to help a party grossly in laches. So it was held that though the relationship between herself and the defendant, that is the institution, raised presumption of undue influence, her conduct in keeping quiet for a period of 6 years after any such influence ceased to exist amounted to an affirmation of the gift made by her, and that she could not therefore recover the properties. So the Alcard case indicates that a contract procured by undue influence cannot be rescinded, that is withdrawn, after affirmation, express or implied, nor can it affect rights or alienates for value and without notice of fact. Let us discuss the difference between coercion and undue influence. The first difference, in case of coercion, the consent is given under the threat of an offense forbidden by IPC, or detaining or threatening to detain some property unlawfully. In case of undue influence, the consent is given by a person who is so situated in relation to another that the other person is in position to dominate his will. Second difference, coercion need not proceed from the parties to contract. It may proceed from third person or stranger. But in case of undue influence, the undue influence is between the parties to the agreement only. Number three, the contract is voidable at the option of one of the parties to the contract in case of coercion. But in case of undue influence, the contract is either voidable or the court may enforce it in a modified form. Next difference, the court cannot draw the presumption of coercion, whereas in case of undue influence, the court may draw the presumption of undue influence if the circumstances so warrant it. Number 5, coercion is mainly of physical nature, involving mostly use of physical or violent force. Means in case of coercion, there is a physical pressure applied, whereas in case of undue influence, there is a moral nature involving use of moral force or mental pressure, that is that it is moral coercion. So therefore the undue influence is also known as moral coercion, because in case of undue influence, mental or moral pressure or force is applied. Number 6, the party exercising coercion exposes himself to criminal liability under the Indian Penal Code, besides an action on contract. But in case of undue influence, there is no criminal liability in case of undue influence. So here we have completed undue influence. Thank you. In the next lecture, I will discuss fraud.